You know, there was a pretty long period of time in my younger years where I held the opinion that Uncharted 2 Among Thieves was the greatest game ever made. And think about that, there are so many incredible games that came out in the years prior and in the same year, and yet I was convinced that Uncharted 2 was the best. And I wasn't the only one who thought this, and some even held this opinion for years after, as Among Thieves has a reputation of being the greatest Uncharted game out of the series. But why? Are those people correct? Well, it's been a significant amount of time since I revisited Uncharted 2, and for those who are new here, I've already covered the first Uncharted in a different video, and I recommend you watch that first. For those who just want the Cole's notes, I essentially really enjoyed Uncharted 1, even if it didn't age very well, like, at all. It held up nicely considering its 2007 release, and it's a fun game with a solid gameplay loop, and while there are plot holes and gimmicks that overstay their welcome and graphics that wear its age on its sleeve, it's still worth playing if you're an Uncharted fan for experiencing the series' roots, if not for the nostalgia. I'll be honest, when I went back to Uncharted 1, my expectations were pretty low. But for this game, I'm expecting something killer. Sort of. I'm also expecting the disappointment, as the veil of nostalgia clouding my vision is bound to dissipate. Uncharted can be a really interesting series to cover because it highlights the kind of player you are. Some players value freedom, a good story, and deep mechanics over just being taken for a ride, keeping your hands in the vehicle at all times. Overall though, I found that Uncharted 2 Among Thieves was great, and despite its flaws that it has, this interactive action flick is easily worth revisiting. Just to get some housekeeping done, a lot of you mentioned in my Uncharted 1 video that there were certain glitches and gameplay quirks that were exclusive to the PlayStation 4 release of the game. And I want to clarify that I am playing all of these games on the PlayStation 4 through the Nathan Drake Collection, which provides Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 with better fidelity and a consistent 60 FPS. I use this version because it's the only one I have, and there's a good chance that if any of you were to finally give these games a go or just replay them, you would likely purchase the remaster as well. I believe it's the best version, and of course the most accessible, with it being fairly priced and consistently going on sale. Something those of you keen viewers may have already noticed is the gameplay, and more noticeably, my aim. I'll be honest, okay? Over the last few months, I've been gaming on PC and using either a keyboard and mouse or an Xbox One controller, so I've been incredibly rusty. On top of that, the PS5 controller just doesn't fit very well in my hands because of how bulky it is, and I also shattered every bone in my hand before getting footage while saving a stray cat. Okay, maybe that last one was a lie, but excuses aside, the point is, some of the early game footage here will raise a few eyebrows, and I know. I'll also be showing late game spoilers because, let's be real, I want to get this aim off the screen as soon as possible. So, spoilers ahead, for both Uncharted 1 and 2. So something the first game had down pat was the presentation. From lush jungles to ancient tombs, the environments were eye candy, and the remastered frame rate, which runs at a smooth 60 FPS, helps the game keep its age as ambiguous as possible. This is no different in Uncharted 2. And I think actually it looks even better. When I said this game looked better, I was being a bit misleading, because while the game does look good, it is only during gameplay, as the cutscenes here and certain assets didn't seem to get the same polish as noticed right away from the cutscenes. Take a look at this cutscene. It looks pretty good, right? Well, now look at this one. Notice that the darker parts of the scene end up being a mosaic mishmash of muddy colors, and this compression sticks out like a sore thumb. Other things like the chapter titles that overlay the gameplay look equally compressed and lack fine edges, but at least with those you won't notice it very much. While we're piling on the criticisms with this game's presentation, we can look to the glitches here, which aren't really being criticized because I only saw one when escaping Flynn, and it was too funny to bother me, and this was the only bug I encountered. Now that we have all these negatives out of the way, we can get to the positives, and judging by how much time we have left in this portion of the video, it seems we have a lot of ground to cover. Though it may not seem that way because aesthetically, this game looks much the same as the first. But presentation isn't all about good-looking textures and that iconic theme song. The music all over this game is great, and something I appreciated more was the lack of music in some cases. It seems that the team took specific measures to make sure scenes weren't crowded with instrumentals, and in a lot of cases, hearing nothing was what built any fear. Fear they conducted with the visuals too. For a great example, look at all the Yetis in the Himalayas and Tibet. You wander around hearing strange sounds and feeling like you are not alone, and as you climb, the foreground sees a supernatural creature rearing its head right towards the camera, and I promptly peed a little bit. In all seriousness, I still remember the first time I saw this, and I was genuinely spooked to see the silhouette in the darkness, which is where it needs to stay if it were to stay undetected, as its jet black fur contrasts against the white, gray, and blue environments, of which there are plenty. A majority of this game takes place in the white of the snow, and it's surprisingly never too bright or bland, which I appreciated, and it helps make the explosions and enemies pop a lot more, which some of the more colorful environments like Nepal can struggle with barely. Regardless, I greatly appreciate the diversity of the environments here and how they are used within the narrative. We begin the game literally in a cold and sterilized environment with bloodied clothes, and upon entering our many flashbacks, we see more vibrant locales, with even those that can't afford such lush color palettes at least having colorful dialogue peppered in. The second environment you visit, again during a flashback, acts as a bit of a flashback for the player as well. It sees you running through the jungle with Sully by your side, taking down mercenaries and chatting about hookers in a church. Classy. It feels like a proper revisit to the gameplay loop of Uncharted Drake's Fortune, and it reminds players that Naughty Dog knows exactly how to make those environments, and instead of retreading that ground, they make the riskier and ultimately more rewarding attempt to try something different. Sully ends up ditching Nate after these chapters, and we spend time with Chloe and eventually Elena, who occupies a lot of the game's latter half, and she too flirts with a revisiting of the first game's themes. The way her and Nathan almost get into an argument about Elena wanting to assist Drake, but Drake being concerned of her safety, is mentioned, but shut down about as quickly as it comes up with a swift verbal strike from Elena.
Shut up, okay?
That's actually part of what makes trudging through these different environments so entertaining. Nathan Drake is never suffering any separation anxiety, and the way him and his allies bounce dialogue off each other is just as charming as a cigar-smoking Sully is. Within this flashback with Sully, the game makes use of yet another one of its features, or lack thereof. When entering a tomb in Borneo, Sully, Nate, and Chloe have to find the path to a clue, but instead of following a trail of bodies, completing a puzzle, or just plainly searching, the game opts to use flammable resin, which illuminates the color of the blood, allowing you to get intrigued by the mysterious trail, as well as by the chatting of the group. The point I'm trying to make is that there often isn't a dull moment, and when there is, it's for a good reason. Like when entering the present predicament again. It gives the game a chance to, excuse the pun, ice the player and rip them from such fun environments straight into the frozen near death of the present. Spending a majority of the game's latter half in such old frozen wilds and barely standing monasteries makes the eventual arrival at Shambhala even more awe-inducing, as you've been relatively desensitized leading up to that point. The aforementioned monastery is a lot of bricks, mud, and more snow, and even leading into the underground, there's a lot of brass, brown, and black, but when the golden gates open, you are flushed with color and vibrance. Even the enemies here have some purple skin instead of the usual shades of gray. Well, that's about all that's new as far as presentation goes. Everything else is on the same level as the first game, though cutscene animations do look a little smoother. I think the diversity in the environments are what make all the difference in gameplay here, as the before mentioned Nepal served as a great set piece for some urban warfare and helped Drake feel like a fish out of water, or in this case, a fish out of jungles and caves. The jungles and caves that are here look just as good as they did before, and the final setting of Shambhala really hits a high point. As for cutscenes, the cinematography is far better here, and the shots are used in perfect tandem with the score to convey the proper emotions, which lends itself well to the story, which I also felt was far better. But for now, we can look towards what happens in between all of this. The gameplay here, much like a lot of things in this game, doesn't feel like a major departure from the mechanics seen in Drake's Fortune, but the little quality of life changes and the added layer of polish make the gameplay far more enjoyable and consistent in strangely every area except for where it arguably matters most, the gunplay. The shooting here overall feels really good, especially compared to Uncharted 1. The aim assist is a little stronger, which can cause some targeting issues, but as long as I'm not shooting at something that isn't shooting at me, then it can be excused. Ammo is something you'll be scrounging around for frequently here, as each weapon has its own ammo associated with it, meaning an AK-47 can't use the same bullets as an M4 despite them both being assault rifles. I ended up enjoying this more because it forced me to use a bunch of different weapons rather than just one or two. The options for weapons are very familiar, though there are a few new additions like the FAL, which fires in 3-round bursts and has the ability to scope in. You can also use a riot shield, miniguns, turrets, and more. Taking down the new enemies here is the exact same. Just keep shooting until they stop moving, though I did feel like shotguns were especially ranged in this game. The addition of new guns was never something I cared about anyways because they were never the main appeal of the combat. What did appeal to me was the things you did with the guns. Uncharted 2 takes the tried and true gameplay loop of the first game and turns it up to 11, and while this sometimes works really well, it can also lead to moments of frustration frustration, where it seems that player enjoyment, or the player's desire for it, was not really taken into account. This is mostly due to the enemy placement, and to explain what I mean here, let's look at this particular scene where there are two large minigun enemies that are borderline invincible unless they eat around 3 shots from an RPG. This is one of the more vertical sets, so we'll have an advantage of attacking from above. But there's an issue. If you're playing an action hero flick and you see a minigun on the ground, you are bullshitting me if you're saying you aren't beelining for it. The problem is, when you're holding the minigun, you are heavily slowed and you can't take cover, with the obvious trade-off being that you shred just about everything in front of you. The issue with this particular set is that this is one of the few points in which I can get my grubby little hands on this thing, but it's at the bottom of the arena, with a lot of enemies coming topside. So you expose yourself to infinite angles just trying to get to the thing, and because you die so quickly with that many goons riddling you with bullets, I couldn't use it and instead had to resort to staying behind cover and briefly peeking with my pistol. I then thought that perhaps I was intended to bring this into the next room, but no. You have to climb into the next area, which makes you drop the gun. There are moments similar to this later on where a minigun is in a hard to reach spot, such as in Shambhala, and it took a few tries to get into position to turn the tides, but the difference is that the level design allowed for me to make use of the different angles and succeed, whereas this one didn't. Another area where I felt the warfare layouts were not up to snuff was during the tower ascension in the monastery. Ascending the first tower was pretty good both stealth and combat wise, but descending down the second tower became tedious as enemies were able to hit you and spot you from unknown angles, making stealth borderline impossible without multiple resets, and the open combat was annoying for the same reasons. But this was another one of the few times that this was a problem. Another layout I want to draw your attention to is located right outside of the entrance to Shambhala, which has a ton of spots for cover. When you first enter this area, you have to take down an underwhelming handful of enemies, and because of the amount of cover, I assumed that there would be a bigger fight on the way back, and I was correct. But the fight had already taken place, and we can tell who won. I like this slight subversion of my expectations, and it works doubly for showing the player how deadly the Yetis are. Other than the two mentioned earlier, the layouts of the levels here are great as far as gunning about goes, rewarding the player for good positioning, ammo scavenging, and proper aim most of the time. When you're pumping enemies full of lead, you'll likely try to go for the head as it does more damage. Though something to consider here is bullet spread. And yeah, I know I harp on these mechanics, and to be fair, they pop up in a lot of third-person action games, the first and future Uncharted games included, but man, they really kill some of the more tense set pieces here. So many times I would take unnecessary damage due to my reticle being right on an enemy and it just going borderline around them. And it felt like the bullet spread never worked in my favor, and when it did, it was when I was inaccurate. This ended up being the most tilting part of this game, and while it never cost me major deaths or frustration, the mild annoyance was near constant at points. I know I'm gonna see some comments saying, oh, you're just bad at the game, so on screen right now is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Also, lowering the difficulty, of which there are many options, does not remedy this, as it isn't the damage taken that annoyed me, but rather the reason it was taken in the first place. One half remedy that works is just aiming for the body, because if at proper range, the bullet spread no matter what will hit the enemy, and while it does use more ammo and time to take them down, this way it's far more consistent. Other issues like those in Uncharted Drake's Fortune, where I was shot despite being behind cover and even being shot while the enemy was behind a wall, out of sight, have thankfully been fixed as far as I'm aware, which is great. Aside from that which was mentioned above, combat is largely the same as far as gunplay goes, and I think that's okay. I mentioned in my Uncharted 1 video that the gameplay is excusably simple as it acts as scaffolding to hold up the greater set pieces of the game, and the same is true here. But the set pieces are far better, with some seeing you jumping from exploding car to exploding car, shooting enemies with guns, grenades, turrets, and others see you running away from an armored vehicle while shooting it, and even more see you running through collapsed buildings. More on that one later. But the best scene by far is unlucky number 13, the train sequence. Let's be real. I know the train level, you know the train level, everyone knows the train level, okay, so let's not dwell on it for too long. We all know it's great, and it still amazes me that this was pulled off in 2009, as it all flows so well from one environment to the next, having to position yourself from either on top of or inside the cars to avoid not only soldiers on the inside, but the obstacles on the outside was downright brilliant, and it's arguably the peak of the series. One of the encounters at the end of this train segment is against this green man, whose name is Draza, but the game barely mentions it. Regardless of any trouble remembering his name, you'll probably remember his boss fight, and now that I think about it, that's a bit of a stretch, because this guy is more of a walking meat shield that, while eating enough bullets to die from downright lead inflation, can waste you in just a few. I know boss fights have never been a strong suit for Naughty Dog, but this was proper ass. The arena is a train car and you have 2 boxes for cover, on top of the framed entrance. One of the boxes puts you too close to him, as his gun will likely kill you from that range, so you really only have 2 pieces of cover. This guy, on top of doing and taking too much damage, has nothing that separates him from any other enemy, and the fact that he rushes you makes this so much worse, as you'll often be put in a position where you're cornered and have to make a break past him, which often leads to death. Eventually, when you do enough damage to him, he'll bomb rush you to close the gap with hand-to-hand combat. And if his health is low enough by the time that happens, he'll go down like a normal enemy. And if his health is too high, then a simple right hook will be your end. If I'm being honest, this isn't as bad as the Navarro fight at the end of Uncharted 1, but damn if this wasn't an exceptionally poor way to end an otherwise near-perfect sequence. More cover and making his AI less inclined to rush you would be a great way of improving the fight. But if you really want an easy way to make this fight more fun, just let us hop out the windows. In almost every train car leading up to this point, you can hop out of the train window to reposition. How about in this fight, we allow you to do that and make it an integral mechanic. Allow Draza to rush you, forcing the player to get some shots in while they can and then hop out a window. Then allowing you to shimmy to the other side of the car, flipping the arena and putting more distance between you and the green meanie. Better yet, throw a bunch of obstacles on the tracks that the players have to climb out of the way of, making use of your climbing skills under pressure. Fortunately, the second and actually final boss fight is against Lazarevich, and it is better. But not by much. The one thing Lazarevich has over Draza is the concept. Lazarevich, after consuming the resin from the Tree of Life, is near invincible and can't be taken down through the use of too many bullets, making him in fact the only enemy in the game that can't be killed through weapons alone. You instead defeat him by shooting the clumps of resin that cause a dense explosion 12 times! You play this game of cat and mouse with him 12 times before it's over, and while compared to Navarro, it is nice that the player controls the pace of this fight. The way you damage Lazarevich does not change, and even at his halfway point where he begins throwing grenades, merely forcing you to make a quick detour, doesn't change much by and large. And those grenades, much like his shotgun, are one of the ways he can very, very quickly kill you. The grenades in particular can be frustrating because they're thrown often when you aren't looking at the boss, and if you are running in one of the 4 corners of the arena which acts as a funnel, then you are more than likely to be pinned, leading to you either dying to the grenades or to Lazarevich's shotgun. This isn't even without mentioning that if you die after hitting him 11 times, you will have to do the whole thing over, and the worst part is, this isn't even a hard fight. It's just tedious, nauseatingly repetitive, making me let out a sigh of relief and say thank God when it was finally over. This fight had an interesting idea, but it needed more depth and less tedium. Make Lazarevich go down a maximum 9 hits, and make sure for every 3 hits a new wrench is thrown in your takedown plan, like the 4 grenades. I can at least say an additional challenge they add is having parts of the map collapse, forcing you to take different paths and run, jump, and climb away from Lazarevich. For now though, avoid climbing if possible because it was common for Drake to grab the corner of a ledge and sit there unwilling to climb up. And that's so strange too, because the movement here felt so much more polished in every other part of the game. I felt on multiple occasions that the movement was imprecise in Uncharted 1, and while there are a few moments like that here, they were truly few and far between. To be fair, some of them were due to pure inaccuracy on my part, and I only mention that so I have an excuse to show this clip where I completely missed a jump with excellent confidence. Unfortunately, a complaint I heard a lot with this game was that it was sometimes tough to distinguish the climbable parts of the environment from the non-climbable. I gotta be honest here though, I just don't see it. I was pretty easily able to figure out what to climb, and if I couldn't, it was pretty easy to just find it by throwing myself against different objects. This issue showed up for most people, most notably in Nepal, as it is very urban, and while some protruding bricks in most areas look noticeable and indicate something meant for climbing, in an urban war zone this is less so. Still, I think climbing on things like signs and protruding architecture was normalized by this point in the game and even in the series, so it came naturally for me. I also enjoyed attempting to find the way forward in these scenarios because it often led to a treasure, giving me another hit of dopamine. These treasures can unlock different skins, secrets, and gameplay modifiers that make repeat playthroughs a lot more fun and interesting. I just wish more games these days did this kind of stuff. You can even equip the new tranquilizer weapon through this menu, which can allow you to silently take down enemies. While this particular weapon is used very scarcely within the campaign, your fists show up time and time again when engaging in the new stealth mechanics here, moving from cover to cover and pressing square when near an enemy to perform a myriad of takedowns, but for the time and even to this day, it's perfectly acceptable. I appreciated that the stealth here was challenging but also pretty forgiving in a lot of cases, especially those in which getting spotted is an instant fail. You may notice that a lot of the encounters here actually can't be done entirely through stealth, and that's fine. The stealth here is best used for thinning out the numbers and taking down any foes that could be a pain in the neck when in open combat. As shown with the 2 minigun enemies, stealth can also be used to put yourself in advantageous positions with advantageous weapons too. I can't say too much about it because, like the gunplay, it's so bare bones, but it was a lot of fun, and I'm glad this returned in future games. I think allowing us to go through entire sections with stealth alone could have been cool, but I understand why they weren't going for that in a game like this, where explosions and gunfire are meant to take center stage. If you do get into open combat and don't have a weapon, then you can engage in the reworked hand-to-hand combat. In Uncharted 1, the melee combat was pretty janky for me and relatively inefficient compared to just shooting, so I avoided it where possible. Here, you just mash the square button and occasionally press triangle to secure a beatdown, and it works fine. It wasn't mind-blowing, but again, it's a feature and an option I'm glad made a return to future entries and saw further refinements. So talking about the individual elements of gameplay is fine, but where Uncharted really comes together is in its execution of its set pieces. I mentioned that the gameplay, despite being basic, is excused because you're never doing just that. You're never doing just shooting. It's shooting with an interesting weapon, or on a platform mid-mudslide, or on a train, moving vehicle signs, you get it. There's a lot of variation. In between these set pieces, there's bite-sized action to keep you stimulated, such as a floor or a bridge collapsing under your weight, but these moments lose a lot of their luster very quickly. The issue I had with them is that you always knew when they were coming, except for this section on the bridge, and I'll explain why this works so well, but instead, let's look at other cases where they didn't have the same success. Let's look at this train car. There's no way forward, to the left, right, up. When you are funneled into an area like this, you're expecting something to go wrong, and most would expect, because the car is elevated, for the floor to collapse. And that's exactly what happens. Of course, this is going to be an issue on multiple playthroughs, but this shouldn't be an issue on the first. I know this may sound nitpicky, but if you played this game, then you know that finding issues with the gameplay is grasping at straws to begin with. Anyways, I think a solution to this is to offer a proper path forward. It doesn't have to be complete, however, in the train car instance, it would go a long way if even a door or an exit was added. It would bring more tension to the scene because then the player is genuinely getting thrown off track and not instead going exactly where they're supposed to. In the case of the bridge from earlier, I think this works well because you have a way forward, and because Elena is moving forward as well. It makes its collapse truly unplanned, and almost dying from a fall should never be part of the plan. You shouldn't be able to just open up your journal and have the next event shown to you, and the same goes for the solution to puzzles. In the first Uncharted, I had a pretty big issue with the puzzles, as they were all simple and took no forethought or thought at all actually from the player. You often just open your journal and the answer was presented to you, and the puzzle just consisted of a few seconds of quote-unquote solving the puzzle, and then a minute or two of actually executing the solution. Here, I unfortunately have to report that they didn't get much harder. They do ease you into things quite quickly, which I can commend, as the first few tasks ask that you simply do things like look up and follow lines, which teaches you to analyze your environments. Any puzzles after, however, don't take advantage of these lessons, as again, they are solved by just taking a peek at your journal. The only upside here is that the puzzles aren't as frequent, but they still take a considerable amount of time to complete after being given the solution. There was at least one mid-combat puzzle that I enjoyed a fair bit, which was when a minigun-bearing enemy was on top of some logs. We can shoot the straps on the logs to cause them to roll off the train, and subsequently the minigun enemy. In other cases, like one where you're stuck in a booby-trapped room, there's all of this tension as a spiked roof collapses on top of you, and if having an open gear wasn't obvious enough, having a tutorial prompt telling you how to throw a grenade is about as close as we get to the game basically playing itself. Funnily enough though, this grenade solution didn't even work and I had to use my guns to break the gears. Now, I could have turned these hints off, but I liked having them on because I want to know how the developers intend for me to actually complete the many scenes here. While Uncharted 2 on the surface is a linear game, it is actually far more linear under the hood. For example, take a scene where a tank is bulldozing through Tenzin's village and we have to keep up with the tank while also finding rockets to shoot at it. The problem that can't show up here is that if you don't follow the exact path the game wants you to take, the level falls apart. For example, when I went to the wrong area, I was blown away by the tank, and when I respawned, I was on top of the building in which I died. This was where the game wanted me to be, but I felt disoriented as I was now in a seemingly new environment. Further on in the level, I arrived at a fork in the road, and for some reason felt funneled to the left where the tank was, assuming I could hop inside it and take the gunner out. When I got close to it, I realized it could not hit me, and after a bit of fumbling around, I also realized that this is not where I was supposed to be. But before I could correct course, I was smited down. Within the same mission, there are similar inconsistencies that could pull some people out. Like when the tank is seemingly able to catch up to Drake no matter how far away he is, even at lightning speeds. But I just took this as a game acting as a movie in the same manner where enemies don't reload. Or when Nathan Drake in a borderline yelling volume tells Elena to be quiet.
Hey, shh. Alright, keep your head down.
It's just a video game thing, and it doesn't really affect a playthrough. In fact, it actually works in the game's favor a lot of the times. When you follow a scene the way the game wants you to, there's a constant stream of explosions, action, bullets, and that's where the game excels. Take the helicopter chase within Nepal. Everything in this scene, because I followed where the game intended me to go, worked perfectly and ends up being one of the most memorable scenes in the game for me. Jumping from building to building as each collapses behind you to eventually escaping a collapsing building as a helicopter has constant pressure on you was exceptional. It also highlights a fun mechanic where characters react to where you go, as Chloe exemplifies when I, for some reason, tried to enter the elevator of a collapsing building.
No, not the elevator.
Good point.
This entire sequence is just a chef's kiss if I've ever seen one, and there are so many like it across the series. It's incredible that Uncharted 2 can feel so different and like such a step up from the first game despite having so many similarities with it. Things like Drake and Sully and eventually Drake and Elena moving through jungle environments and even the end of the game introducing supernatural stakes and enemies are all things that we've seen before. There's even a callback to the first game's final act as you briefly pick up an MP40, which was introduced in the latter third of Uncharted 1. Unfortunately, something that has received a lot of criticism across the series has been its story. And I'm even guilty of that, as I criticize the story in Uncharted 1 for being perfectly fine on the surface, but the moment you begin to ask questions, the plot starts crumbling away. And the same is true here. The narrative in Uncharted 2 is basically the same as the first game. Drake and friends have no money and begin to hunt for an ancient long-lost treasure where trouble is amuck, as a very wealthy and powerful villain is after the same thing. As the two parties race to the treasure, one usually being right behind the other, it's revealed that the treasure has supernatural properties, leading to an epic conclusive fight between Nathan Drake and whoever the big bad is, resulting in Drake deciding that the treasure is simply too powerful to be left in the power of humans, and he discards it while ending up with Elena and Sully for a happy ending. In case you've forgotten, I'm talking about Uncharted 2, and you probably have forgotten because that summary applies to the first 3 Uncharted games and even, albeit to a lesser extent, Uncharted 4. Perhaps I'm doing a disservice to the game here because Uncharted 2 actually has some great moments, and I think the story here is good, but let's not pretend it isn't much like any other blockbuster film sequel, basically the same plot as the first. But again, that doesn't stop the characters and mystery of Shambhala from being engaging. The plot begins with Nathan Drake nearly dying from a train wreck, and as we move through the wreckage on near death, we experience flashbacks of how he got there, which is through the help of Flynn, a treasure hunter who enlists Nathan's help in order to locate a lamp for a well-paying client, promising fortune and the help of the best driver in the business, Chloe, whom, judging by the expression on Drake's face, he's met before. As the crew breaks into a museum to steal the lamp, Flynn double-crosses Drake, leading to him landing in a Turkish prison, only to be rescued by Sully and Chloe, using the last of Drake's fortune from the first game to pay for his bail. Drake, initially untrusting of Chloe, is convinced to hunt down Flynn and the treasure, this time being motivated by both fortune and revenge. Chloe, however, still works with Flynn and the revealed mastermind behind the operation, Lazarevich, to drop intel for Drake. Sully and Nate then do some exploring, and eventually as Nate heads to Nepal to follow the trail of Marco Polo and runs into Elena, we get the idea that these two did not end on great terms. With her cameraman Jeff, Chloe, Nate, and Elena move through the city until receiving their next clue, but not before Jeff is shot and left in critical condition. The group continue moving forward, but are cornered by Flynn and Lazarevich. Wanting to assert dominance, Lazarevich shoots Jeff, and the two left standing make a break for it. Once back to safety, the crew realizes they have to save Chloe, and in order to, they chase her down to a train, and when confronting her, Nate is shot by Flynn, and in a last-ditch effort, Nate blows up the train car in front of him, causing the whole train to go off the rails, and that's where we get sent back to the present. After passing out in the snow, we're saved by a Tibetan man named Tenzin, who escorts us to Elena, who tracked us down, and a man named Schaefer, someone who went on the same quest that Drake did. Sending Tenzin and Drake to find the remains of his fellow soldiers, Drake discovers that the treasure within Shambhala can corrupt those who drink it, turning them into monsters. When returning to the village, it seems that Lazarevich has caught up with Drake, leaving him and Tenzin to secure it, and finding that Schaefer has been kidnapped. As Elena and Drake track him down to a monastery, they find him dead, and encounter Chloe, who gives Drake the key to Shambhala only on the promise that he takes Lazarevich down. Unfortunately, right as Elena and Drake are about to enter the hidden city, Lazarevich and Flynn catch up to them and force Drake to help them get in. As Drake and Flynn solve some puzzles, they discuss Flynn's fate and what will happen to him once Lazarevich has what he needs, with Drake explaining that his future doesn't look bright. Once inside the city, the group is immediately attacked by Shambhala's residents, and Nate and friends are separated from Flynn and Lazarevich. As Drake explores, he discovers that the treasure in Shambhala is really sap from the Tree of Life, and that Lazarevich plans to weaponize it. Before they can move further, Flynn, fatally injured by Lazarevich, has one final middle finger to give Drake, in the form of a grenade which puts Elena in critical condition. The crew decides to leave, but before they do, Nate decides he needs to stop Lazarevich permanently. He does this, but instead of killing him, Drake leaves Lazarevich to be killed by the inhabitants of Shambhala. Nathan and his allies escape, and then we fast forward to the Tibetan village, where Chloe and Nathan part ways, and Nathan and Elena end up sharing one of the most wholesome pieces of dialogue in the franchise.
You were at least an 8.
An 8?
You were a total 8.
An 8? Those guardian things were an 8.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, those were terrifying.
What's a 10?
Clowns?
Clowns over my death?
I hate
Clowns?
clowns. I hate clowns.
Oh my word. You thought I was dead.
So while the story is a lot more convoluted this time around and a bit longer, again, the individual characters steal the show here. Something that immediately stood out to me was that even though the story is similar to the first game, it's not like the writers have forgotten what happened in the first, and more importantly, what worked. To get an example, look no further than Nate and Elena. When they meet again, we see that things must have taken a turn for the two, as Nate doesn't even refer to her and Jeff as friends, just journalists. I immediately expected them to retread the forming of their amicability, which they do to an extent, but they don't forget the events of the first game. When they're in Nepal, there are 2 points in which Elena and Nate show that they have learned from their time with one another in the first game. The first is when Elena explains that she's coming to help Drake, and Drake instinctively says that it's too dangerous, but Elena shuts it down near immediately by just telling him to shut up. It's like she, acting as a voice for the writer, is saying, we've done this song and dance before, and we know this is a fight you aren't winning, so let's just go. Another moment like this is when Jeff is shot. Notice how Elena doesn't even bother trying to grab the camera, and when Jeff does try, she doesn't stop Nate from telling him to leave it. Letting go of the camera was something Elena had to eventually do in Uncharted, and while a detail like this is completely minuscule to the point of arguably not meaning much, I think it goes a long way for continuity within the story, and I appreciated it a lot. Elena and Nate even give references to things that haven't happened on screen. Like when devising a plan to get to the train, they have this discussion that hints at some previous communication issues.
Now I'm going down there alone.
Nate.
Wait, just listen. You never listen.
Nate has some equally enjoyable dialogue with Sully, though it is short-lived. I also wanted to mention that they directly reference Nate's luck in this game, which was nice to see.
Listen, I don't have your luck.
The dialogue between everyone was pretty good too, and they do a great job of filling in the gaps between the action and plot advancements.
From there, we're in. Yeah, in like Flynn, right?
What?
In like Flynn.
I don't get it.
Just give me a boost.
On the flip side of Nate and Elena, we have Nate and Chloe, which while not as good, did its job of entertaining well enough, though her constant side-switching to keep her cover with Flynn made her a character that I couldn't grow attached to, and she doesn't have that much development across the game. She is just introduced, and we're shown that her and Nate have a romantic history together, and while that works, I would have liked more. At least she gets some development during the story, but even then it's pretty minimal, as the most I could find was that during the Nepal chapters, she insists on leaving Jeff, seeing him as dead weight, which was pretty harsh, but by the time she is in the same situation with Elena, she makes sure that she is brought with them and even prioritizes her safety. But even this could have been just chalked up to her wanting to avoid the ensuing argument between her and Drake if she were to suggest leaving her behind. And perhaps because of how much Elena meant to Drake, she decided for his sake it was worth bringing her. A lack of development is unfortunately something that plagues a lot of the characters here, including the main antagonists this time around, Flynn and Lazarevich. Flynn was fine enough. His initial betrayal did come as a slight shock, and his constant condescending tone towards Drake was entertaining enough, but ultimately he, like a more enjoyable Navarro, was just the lapdog of the brains of the operation, Lazarevich. Lazarevich, while ultimately the same architect of older fellow with too much money and a lust for power, was far more memorable than the latter because he was more present. Lazarevich gets his hands dirty and is a constant threat, while Roman very consistently got others to do the dirty work for him. I think the biggest weakness for Lazarevich was that his motivations were purely power, but I feel like a criticism like that is a little mute because it can be argued that that's the point. Just like any big movie villain, he's meant to be an evil, all-powerful antagonist that the protagonist has to defeat against all odds. When you do take down Lazarevich, he makes a pretty interesting observation. He claims that Drake should strike him down since he kills so many others, and this entire line sent my mind into a frenzy as I recalled the endless discussions of Nathan Drake and killing. A discussion I'm going to subject you to now. There's this strange disconnect when playing the Uncharted games because they often paint Nate as the good guy, and morally speaking, he is. Sure, he is pursuing greed in most scenarios, but he definitely has a strong moral compass that trumps any desire for wealth. But the thing is, despite being seen as a good person, he slaughters a small town's population by the end of just one of these games. Some felt it strange that Nathan goes through all of these men, but then the game acts like these kills never happened. Most argue that kills in gameplay don't count, and even if they did, they were done in self-defense. Except some have argued otherwise by citing the many times Drake kills someone that was simply in his way, like this guy.
Sweet dreams.
There's a guy below you. There's a guy below you.
Except wait! He swims away! But this is just one example. I mean, there are plenty of other times where Drake will engage in battle, assumedly knowing that he'll kill people, so what does this mean? It means that the story here is pretty inconsistent, but if the very few kills and cutscenes are justified, then why does Lazarevich bring this up? Unless to say that the gameplay kills are acknowledged, which then begs the question, why is this guy not in prison? It's just one of those things the game doesn't have an answer for, and I feel doesn't necessarily need one. Again, in this game, much like in Uncharted 1, when you start asking questions, you realize the game does not have an answer for everything. For example, there's no way Elena and Drake just randomly encountered one another like this, right? How did Drake get spotted in Nepal, but not Chloe despite the two being attached at the hip? How did Elena track down Drake after the train? What are the odds that Drake wakes up in a village where the only English-speaking person is the person who can set Drake back on the right track? Why were the people of Shambhala wearing fursuits to scare people away when their base appearance is intimidating enough? Why is there a sky when Shambhala is underground? But again, like the first game, these questions don't really take away from the plot that much if you go in with the right mindset of being taken for a ride, rather than looking for exceptional storytelling. Now, I am not saying that you can't look for that, or that a story that does away with explaining everything is more valuable, but I'm just saying that Uncharted likely isn't trying to tell a deep, intelligent story, because if it was, I doubt they would fail this hard on 4 separate occasions. That doesn't mean the story overall isn't good enough here, I think it is. But I think the story is lifted up by the other assets of the game, allowing it to be much greater than the sum of its parts, much like the game and the product as a whole. I think Uncharted 2 as its own product is pretty great. Yes, its story may not have been the best, and its gameplay mechanically simple, but its presentation, dialogue, and set pieces are so fantastic, and they elevate the otherwise mediocre parts of this game much higher than they could be if they were on their own. As a sequel, however, I think Uncharted 2 is top-notch, as it took nearly everything that the previous game did well, and did it better and in different ways. The environments compared to the first game were different, but also done exceptionally well with more diversity and more depth. There was a certain amount of love that went into these environments, like Tenzin's home village, which features a ton of interactions, all of which aren't told to the player, making it even more endearing. The gameplay mechanics, while largely the same, have some small quality of life improvements like the more accurate climbing and wider range of weapons. Unfortunately, in the process of ironing out nearly every gameplay kink from the first game, a new, very impeding problem reared its ugly head, which is the gun accuracy. But with how solid the shooting is, it can be excused. The addition of stealth and further refinements to the hand-to-hand combat went miles for making the gameplay loop here more varied and fun. And while the puzzles here were much the same as the first, their increased rarity makes them far more tolerable in my eyes. The story obviously wasn't the best, but it had this charm to it that I think a lot of games can't quite capture. It's a ride that knows what it's trying to be, and while it doesn't land every time, it lands most of the time. It works far better than the first game in my opinion because it feels like more happens and we have a wider cast. But I think the evolution of Nathan and Elena's relationship was better in the first game just by virtue of it being the main focus instead of having half of their time together being taken up by Chloe. Finally, I think it goes entirely without saying that the action here is what really elevates it above the first game. Shooting grenades at a helicopter while on a rooftop, having an entire level set on a train, jumping from vehicle to vehicle to get to the front of a convoy is just so much fun, and while yes, the boss fights do weigh it down a bit, the overall package of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves is still great, and I think it goes without saying that this is worth your time and money. I mentioned that I thought for a long time that this was the greatest game ever, and I also remember being absolutely psyched for the release of Uncharted 3, Drake's Deception. Uncharted 2 is a game that, upon revisiting, held up well, and I really hope Uncharted 3 does that too. Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video. This is the first video edited by PlayStation, who is a lovely editor that I've gotten into contact with thanks to a mutual friend of Gaming Wins. So let me know how the editing is in this video. You can comment and let me know if there's anything that needs to be changed. Feel free to let me know and then I'll pass it on to Sean. And I think Sean did a really good job. The reason I got the editor is because school is starting to ramp up at my new university and I'm getting swamped with homework. What having an editor will help me do is keep a consistent flow of content for you guys while I'm in school and kind of being pulled away by that. And then when I'm not in school, I can then put out pretty much twice as much content. I could not afford such a great editor if it wasn't for you guys being so supportive on these videos and watching them, and especially for our Patreon members. So thank you to Ben Conway, Bossy and Chiefy, Chris, Gonzo Gonzalez, Lemur Lord, Mark Short, Nathan Figs, Pirate, TJ Clark, Toyota, Jeff Alt, Hednar845, and Vinley Wilson. I really appreciate it. And of course our YouTube members, we can't forget them, Daniel Littau, Breeze Over, and Lane. Your support is very helpful to me, and I feel like I say I appreciate it too much, but you guys kind of know at this point I appreciate it. If you want to see these videos early, you can become a YouTube member and a patron down below, and you can follow me on Twitter if you want to see more updates about videos and all that kind of stuff. We recently, well, it happened a few weeks ago, but I hit 100,000 subscribers, and I don't even know how to feel. I don't want to say thank you because I say it too much and I feel like it gets really fucking annoying. But fuck you guys. Thank you. I appreciate it. You guys are the best. And I know every YouTuber says that. It's like a cliche to be like, you guys are the best fans ever. But it truly does feel that way because I don't deserve this kind of job, and I don't think I deserve this kind of support from you guys, and so it makes me even more grateful for that kind of stuff. And I apologize for my voice. It's very tired. Expect some new videos coming soon. There will be another shorter video around the same length as this one, maybe a bit shorter, and then there will be the video after that will be around an hour, I would say, maybe longer. We'll kind of have to wait and see. All right, take care guys, and stay safe.